Hello everyone, my name is Kriti Vikram and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. Today I shall be speaking on early marriage and health in midlife, evidence of weathering among Indian women. The second author of this paper is Mu Zhang, who is my colleague in the Department of Sociology at NUS. Early marriage has been a defining feature of the marital landscape in India. According to the National Family Health Survey, which is the Indian DHS, conducted in 2005, 44.5% of women in the ages of 20 to 24 were married before the age of 18 years. The recent NFHS 4, conducted in 2015, shows 27% of women in the same age group report as being married before the age of 18 years. Main determinants of early marriage include household poverty, low education of the parents, patriarchal traditions, higher dowries associated with later reject marriage and higher education, protection of honor and preserving virginity, as well as region of residence. As can be seen in the map, there are certain regions where early marriage is more pervasive. Even though more recent statistics present an encouraging trend, they continue to represent a large number of women. Consequences of early marriage are several. Firstly, they lead to lowered educational attainment and therefore lower earning potential, as well as limited autonomy in several life domains. It predisposes women to a heightened risk of interpersonal violence and domestic abuse. It is also associated with higher fertility, as well as a range of poor reproductive and sexual health outcomes. Early and frequent childbearing is also linked with lower maternal body mass index and anemia among women in India. Literature also highlights the negative intergenerational effects of early marriage, as reflected by higher infant and child mortality among children born to women married as a child, lowered anthropometric scores of children, as well as lower cognitive achievement. Surprisingly, there is very limited evidence on mental health outcomes. There are a few studies that show early marriage is associated with anxiety, depression, and even suicidal ideation in other contexts. As might be evident to you, the thrust of the literature is primarily on reproductive and maternal health consequences of adolescent and early motherhood. The foci of this body of research, therefore, is limited to adolescent girls and young women. In my opinion, it is myopic in its assessment of the impact of early marriage on women's health, because it ignores the cumulative influence of life stressors, which are precipitated by early marriage and lead to poor health over her lifespan. To develop a theoretical framework for this paper, we draw upon established literature. We include accumulation of disadvantage, stress proliferation, and weathering of health over the life course. The girls who get married at a young age are disadvantaged to begin with. They come from poor households and have parents who are less educated. However, getting married at an early age exacerbates their disadvantage. It does so by exposing them to a series of secondary stressors which emerge from the initial primary stressor, that is, early marriage. Geronimus talks about weathering of health in the context of Black women in the United States. She says early health deterioration among Black women can be seen as a consequence of the cumulative impact of repeated experience with social or economic adversity, political marginalization, and the experience of racism. This is true for women who get married at a young age as well, because they experience marginalization, are faced with repeated adversities within their marital homes, and experience a range of negative outcomes. Now, early marriage is not just associated with reproductive and sexual health outcomes, it is also associated with isolation and alienation. This is primarily due to the practice of patrilocal exogamy, in which women marry outside their community. They move into new villages or new cities and leave behind their family and friends. Monica Das Gupta says that young women in marital households experience double powerlessness. This is because they experience the lowest autonomy as a consequence of their junior status within the household, as well as their gender. We've already discussed how early marriage is associated with a range of negative reproductive and sexual health outcomes and violence and abuse. All of these factors thrust women into a situation where they face untimely transitions and intense role strain. In a short span of time, they move from being daughters to daughter-in-laws, wives, and even mothers. All these factors would lead to greater allostatic load, leading to poorer health outcomes by the time they are in their midlife. I asked 3 research questions in this paper. Is early marriage associated with worse self-rated health, higher functional impairment, and chronic diseases among currently married women in India? Can early marriage predispose women to premature health deterioration? Is the health disadvantage associated with early marriage due to selection alone, or is it due to the physiological deterioration of the human body as a consequence of the stress and strain inherent in such marriages? To answer these questions, I utilized the India Human Development Survey. This is a nationally representative panel survey of 38,000 households, fielded in 2 waves, in 2004 and 5 and 2011 and 12. It was able to re-interview a large proportion of the wave 1 sample. About 83% of the original sample is retained in the panel. It is jointly conducted by the University of Maryland at College Park and the National Council of Applied Economic Research. This paper uses the second wave of the survey, which was carried out in 2011 and 12, which has 36,283 currently married women in the ages of 15 to 55. The panel data is also utilized to assess worsening of health over a woman's life course. The sample is restricted to 16,474 currently married women in their middle ages, that is between 35 to 55 years of age. The independent variable is early marriage. The legal age of marriage in India and the international community is before the age of 18 years. In India, girls may get married at a fairly young age, but start to experience the effects of early marriage only once a ceremony called Gauna takes place. Between their marriage and the Gauna ceremony, they continue to live in their natal households. Therefore, in this paper, and as several papers have done in the past, I use the age at Gauna as an indicator for age at marriage. In this paper, we utilize several dependent variables: self-rated health, functional limitations, and doctor-diagnosed chronic diseases. Self-rated health is based on the survey question, which asks, in general, how would you say your own health is? It is rated on a 5-point scale. Functional limitations is a composite score based on a series of questions to assess the degree of disability of the respondent. Doctor-diagnosed chronic conditions. These include heart diseases, high blood pressure, and diabetes. The reason why we utilize these three conditions is because there is a robust link which has been established between psychosocial stress, higher allostatic load, and the development of these diseases. We use the panel to study worsening of health in midlife. For all the three outcome variables, 3 dichotomous indicators are created to indicate worsening of health status over the 2 waves. We use linear regression as well as propensity score matching for the IHDS wave 2 data. The sample includes women between the ages of 15 to 55 years. For the panel, which includes women in the ages of 35 to 55 years, we carry out logit regression as well as PSM. We include a range of relevant controls such as women's education, age, spouse's education, household assets, religion and caste of the household head, number of children a woman has, as well as her experience of child mortality and state of residence. Linear regression results show that early marriage has a detrimental effect on the health status of women on all 3 outcomes. The weathering hypothesis suggests the cumulative effects of exposure to chronic and acute stresses lead to premature health deterioration, and we find the evidence of weathering. In the cross-sectional data with IHDS2, we find that for self-rated health and functional limitations, women who were married early experienced worse health in midlife. Panel analyses show that early marriage is associated with the development of functional limitations and chronic conditions, as well as with worsening of self-rated health between the ages of 35 to 55 years. Here we show the predicted probabilities of self-rated health by age at marriage. The red line indicates married at an early age, and the higher score represents worse health. As is evident here, that women who were married early experience worse health and are more likely to rate their health negatively, particularly so after the ages of 30 years. Similarly, we see that for functional limitations, those women who were married earlier are likely to experience worsening of health. And this disadvantage becomes prominent after the age of 40 years. Women who were married earlier are more likely to report higher chronic conditions. However, there is convergence between the health status of women who were married at an early age with those that were married at a later age. We also carry out propensity score matching to exclude selection as an explanation for our results. As can be seen, that estimates using the nearest neighbor as well as radial caliper show that the differences between the 2 groups are statistically significant across all the outcomes. In conclusion, we need to broaden our perspective to assess the enduring influence of early marriage on later life health. Although this study pertains to India, it is of relevance to other contexts where gender inequality and restrictive norms impact the life course of women. Although this paper does not provide a direct test of mechanisms that link early marriage to poorer health outcomes, it draws upon rich existing literature to establish the link between early marriage and exposure to stressful circumstances. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I hope you are doing well during this difficult time. I am Dan Ying. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Social Policy, University of Birmingham, UK. Today, I'm very delighted to be able to present my work here online. I'm very glad to see that the ASA annual conference is still going ahead and that I could still participate in this. Today, I'm going to present the paper, Does ethnic diversity affect well-being and allostatic load among people across neighborhoods in England? This is a collaboration between 3 researchers here at Birmingham, Professor Miles Houston, a social psychologist from the University of Oxford, and Professor Douglas Massey from Princeton University. In this presentation, I will briefly introduce the background on this topic, including another paper done by this team. I will then present the model, statistic analysis, findings, and also conclusions from our current paper. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. As you know, globalization has, and still is, changing the ethnic and religious background of our society. And within the social sciences disciplines, there has been an increasing concern with the effects of these demographic changes. However, the overall message of research on this topic has been mixed. Initial work has found that social diversity is associated with lower economic performance, social capital, school funding, increased intergroup conflicts, and reduced civil engagement. However, more recent research suggests that these negative effects can be mitigated. For example, diversity creates opportunities for intergroup contact that in turn promote more positive intergroup attitudes. Another study has found that exposure to diversity leads to openness to multicultural experiences. The effects of these changes have been discussed in different social sciences disciplines, focusing mainly on societal outcomes, and their impact on individuals has so far been completely neglected. In this project, we addressed this research gap by adopting an individual-level focus and asked what we believe to be an interesting and fundamental question. How will these changes affect our well-being and health? To answer this question, we took models of human evolution so that we could better understand how individuals react to these demographic changes. This research argues that as a result of evolutionary selective process, humans have the predisposition to contrast in-groups from out-groups. This process is adaptive, given that surviving is contingent upon the cooperation with other in-group members. In addition, humans are found have evolved with a preference for homogeneity and stability. We also call this homophily. Regarding outgroups, we also know that humans tend to approach outgroups with a certain degree of uncertainty. Unknown others could be friends or foes, prey or predators, and caution in new encounters could dictate one's survival. Overall, the human brain evolved to sustain motivated cognition and behavior relevant to in-group survival and cooperation, and to defend against potential threats such as outgroups. Despite this, we see that cooperation is often extended to outgroups. Indeed, biological and cultural research suggests that Humans have evolved and fared better than other species because contact with outgroups bring a variety of benefits that cannot be attained by in-group interactions. This is, for example, biological advantage in gaining genetic variability through new mating opportunities. This is, for example, individuals acquire more diverse resources and knowledge. This is, for example, trust to and collaboration with outgroups largely outweighed benefits and costs of intergroup conflicts, contributing to the proliferation of group beneficial behaviors. So, individuals have to balance two apparently opposing tendencies. But here we argue that these tendencies are not on opposites. They just develop at different times. So, for example, an increase in religious diversity might trigger tendencies for in-group protection, but with time, individuals should reorient themselves by adopting out-group focused cognition and behaviors. In our recent work, we found that across different societies and cultures, increasing religious diversity was associated with poor health and well-being, but the effects dissipated with time. To further understand this relationship, we examined in this paper two important mechanisms. One is the negative mechanisms, which is the erosion of social cohesion and trust in others brought by increasing diversity. The other is a positive mechanism. Through intergroup contact, there is a positive relationship between diversity and health and well-being. We found that changes in religious diversity in the short term is associated with lower trust, in turn, poor quality of life. However, in the long term, with time, intergroup contact emerged and counteracted initial negative effects. In our current research, inspired by our previous one, we look at how ethnic diversity of English local areas affect individuals' subjective well-being and also objective stress measured by allostatic load. I will come back to explain this later. We analyzed in this paper a large panel dataset containing over 47,000 English respondents living in more than 15,000 neighborhoods in England, from the British Household Panel Study and the UK Household Longitudinal Study, covering the years between 2004 and 2011. We match all the respondents from the survey to their neighborhoods using geographical identifiers. We thus have two levels of variables. At the individual level, we control for age, gender, race, highest education, employment status, all these standard individual level controls that are believed to be associated with health and well-being. We also, at the contextual level, we control ethnic diversity, our variable of interest, as well as multiple deprivation. Here is how we measure LSO A-level ethnic diversity. We use the most widely used Simpson's index. This is also known as Herfindahl index. It measures the likelihood of randomly selected individuals within a community belonging to different ethnic groups. So 0 would indicate maximum homogeneity. In our data, ethnic diversity is ranging from 0 to 0.87. The average is 0.19. We also use other diversity measures, such as Shannon index, such as evenness index. We use these alternative measures of ethnic diversity to check the robustness of our results. It's worth noting that regardless of the measure of ethnic diversity, our main results still hold. Here are our outcome variables. Our outcome variables are twofold. We have three measures for subjective well-being and health. They are overall life satisfaction, perceived general health status, and GHQ-36, which is a score that measures mental health status. We use factor analysis to combine these three indicators into a composite well-being indicator. We unify the scales of these variables so that a higher value always indicates a better outcome. We also measure respondents' objective stress level, allostatic load. Allostatic load presents the wear and tear our body experiences when we are exposed in stressful situations. We can call this chronic stress. A study conducted in lab amongst a group of students find that after a first interaction with a cross-ethnic partner, participants with higher prejudice scores display a peak in their cortisol level, which is an indicator of objective stress. We thus also test whether or not increasing ethnic diversity is associated with higher allostatic load, i.e. higher stress. Here is our model. We adopt a three-level multi-level modeling framework to analyze the effects of ethnic diversity on well-being and health. This is three-level because individual I living in area J and observed at time T. We decompose our regressor of interest, ethnic diversity, into two parts. First is the average ethnic diversity within an area between 2001 and 2011. The second part is the deviation of yearly ethnic diversity from its 10-year average level of diversity. The first is the SIMP bar here in the equation, and the later is the def SIMP in the equation. SIMP bar is time invariant, and it stands for the long-term effect of ethnic diversity. And def SIMP is time varying, and the coefficients capture the short-term effect of ethnic diversity. And we, of course, control for a set of individual and contextual level controls. And here are our results. We find that our subjective well-being and health, there is for subjective well-being and health, there is a significant negative relationship between short-term ethnic diversity and outcome, but this does not hold for the long term. Also, both short-term and long-term ethnic diversity have no association with chronic stress, the allostatic load. We further use data to test after how long the effect of short-term ethnic diversity would finally disappear. And here is the result. Orange dots are our point estimations. Upper and lower bars indicates 95% confidence interval, and the dashed line is a fitted line. We can see that based on our estimation, the effect of short-term ethnic diversity is gradually disappearing over time. And using panel data, because we have panel data, we wanted to see if we are able to draw any causal inferences. We thus conducted two additional tests. Because of time limitation, I cannot discuss this in details, but focusing on the stayers, those who never moved home in between waves, they participated in the survey. We find similar result. And using a cross-legged model focusing on those who participated in all waves and never moved home, we find there is significant association between ethnic diversity and next wave of well-being, but not the other way. And also we conduct subgroup analysis focusing on white and non-white, and we find that our result only hold for the white subsample, but not the non-white respondents. Here are the conclusions we draw from the study. Our study shows that in the short term, an increase in contextual level ethnic diversity is associated with worse individual health well-being, but this association will disappear over time. Our results provide evidence of individuals gradually adapting to ethnic diversity. And we also provide evidence of a non-correlation between contextual level ethnic diversity and objective health stress. Of course, we have some limitations in our study. Our analysis for allostatic load is cross-sectional, so we cannot draw longitudinal inferences. And also, data limitations means that we cannot test the mechanism behind why this is the case. Ideally, measures of intergroup contact and trust would be included to test how these factors may explain further the relationship between ethnic diversity and well-being and health. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you have a nice day.
Hi everyone. I hope you are staying safe and coping well during this difficult time. My name is Haewon and I'm a senior researcher at the University of Turku in Finland. It is a bit disappointing that we cannot meet in San Francisco for this year's ASA, but I'm still grateful for this opportunity to present my work. Okay, then let's get started. This paper explores the relationship between grit and subjective well-being in two different countries, South Korea and the United States. In this presentation, I will briefly go over the background of this research and move on to the measurement tests, and then examine the construct validity of the grit measures in two different country samples to examine the utility of grit for subjective well-being research. Some of you may be familiar with the concept grit. Grit, by definition, means perseverance and passion towards life goals. Grit researchers theorized grit as a higher order construct that is composed of two dimensions, perseverance of effort and consistency of interest. So if I describe myself as a gritty person, it means that I work hard and I do not easily shift my interest from one goal to another despite setbacks. This concept got famous because it is known as a strong predictor of success. While the public and academic focus has long been on its role in objective success, some have turned their attention to another consequence of having grit, subjective well-being. For example, previous research showed that the gritty college students report better subjective well-being and less depression. However, there is ongoing debate over the measurement and concept of grit. First critique is about its psychometric properties. A recent meta-analysis found that the two first-order factors are often uncorrelated, or are only weakly correlated. In line with this, some researchers used the separate dimension scores of grit and showed each dimension of grit has different roles in outcome variables. Researchers also cast doubt on grit's distinctive utility in predicting outcome variables beyond its correlates. For example, conscientiousness is highly correlated with grit, and prior studies have shown mixed findings regarding the distinctive utility of grit above and beyond conscientiousness. But these prior studies have mostly focused on grit's utility in academic achievement, and less is known about the grit's role in subjective well-being beyond conscientiousness. To address this gap and examine the distinctive utility of grit in subjective well-being, this study focuses on two psychological measures that relate to both grit and subjective well-being. Sense of control refers to the belief that a person is responsible for whole life outcomes, and it is known to be beneficial for one's subjective well-being. A potential linkage between grit and the sense of control is also suggested. For example, a person who believes in her power and agency over her life outcomes, in other words, has a higher sense of control, likely shows sustained efforts and interests in her life projects, that is, showing a higher level of grit. Conscientiousness as a personality trait is also positively linked to subjective well-being. A high correlation between grit and conscientiousness calls for research on grit's role in subjective well-being, controlling for conscientiousness. However, the majority of prior grit research has relied heavily on selective samples, for example, college students in a single country, particularly in the United States. Less is known about whether the grit scale operates similarly across different cultures. Despite the presumed cultural differences, for example, based on the widely cited cultural dimension of individualism versus collectivism, the concept of grit could be applied to the non-Western collectivist settings. Grit can be also highly valued in East Asian countries, including South Korea, where its Confucian traditions, for example, emphasize diligence and hard work as desirable virtues. To address this gap, the present study focuses on two countries, the United States and South Korea, to examine grit. I contracted with Qualtrics panel to collect online survey data in the United States and South Korea using quota sampling on age groups, gender, and household income. The analysis is limited to those who completed the survey items of interest. The survey instrument includes the grit S scale, personal sense of control scale, and conscientiousness. And these survey items that are not available in the existing international surveys were translated using the translation back translation method. Subjective well-being was measured by averaging two variables, happiness and life satisfaction. Demographic variables are also included in the analysis. Here is the demographic information of the current sample. Respondents of the current study are slightly higher educated than the population, and the average age is slightly younger in Korea. Korean respondents younger than 55 years old were slightly oversampled because of a shortage of participants who are 55 years old or older in the Korean sample. Building on prior studies that validated the grit scale in different samples, including online and non-Western samples, I tested three hypothesized models in this study. A hierarchical model of grit, which was originally suggested by Duckworth, a unidimensional structure of grit, and a two-vector structure of grit. The MLM estimation in M+ was used to handle the multivariate non-normality of the data distribution. Results supported the two-vector structure of grit, and a better fitted model was yielded with a cross-loading of consistency item 4. I have difficulty maintaining my focus on projects that take more than a few months to complete. All items were significantly loaded on the designated grit vectors, and the two latent variables were correlated with each other in both samples. Next, MGCFA supports the partial and metric invariance of the two-factor grit model, providing evidence that respondents of the current cross-cultural sample tend to interpret and respond to grit items in a relatively similar way. Now, based on the measurement test, we move on to the examination of the construct validity of grade in predicting subjective well-being. The tables present the results of the hierarchical regression analysis using global grade here and two separate dimensions of grade. The first model in each section included grade measures in addition to socio-demographic factors. The second model introduced a sense of control. The third model introduced conscientiousness, and the last model in each section included both correlates. Okay, then let's start with the models using global grid in the US results. Model 1 shows global grid is positively associated with subjective well-being controlling for social demographic variables. However, this strong positive effect of having grid on American respondents' subjective well-being is largely reduced when correlates are added. A similar pattern is found in the Korean results. The strong positive effect of having grid on subjective well-being is reduced when correlates are added in models 2, 3, and 4. I find little evidence to corroborate prior studies that argued for the distinctive utility of the global grid over particularly conscientiousness in predicting subjective well-being in the current cross-cultural sample. The positive effect of grid on subjective well-being is reduced by half in the US sample and by more than 2/3 in the Korean sample when conscientiousness is introduced. The analysis using the two dimensions of grid shows slightly different results. Introducing sense of control and conscientiousness in the US sample reduces the benefit of having higher perseverance, but slightly to a lesser degree compared to the models using global grid. By contrast, the consistency dimension of grid adds little to our understanding of one's subjective well-being. In Korea, while perseverance contributes to explaining the variance, in subjective well-being controlling for the sense of control, its role becomes limited when taking conscientiousness into account. This implies that perseverance largely overlaps with conscientiousness in accounting for subjective well-being in the current Korean sample. And the same finding relate to the consistency dimension of grid. Findings of the measurement test supported the two-factor structure of grid in both country samples. Grid is better understood as a construct consisting of two distinct but related dimensions, the perseverance of effort and consistency of interest, rather than as a global grid construct. The aggregated grid score might conceal the different incremental validity of two grid dimensions in understanding subjective well-being. Perseverance is important in one's level of subjective well-being, but having consistent interest seems to be less relevant to subjective well-being in both countries. So basically, sticking to the same goal over the years despite setbacks may not necessarily be helpful for my subjective well-being. When achieving a certain goal seems unrealistic and I experience failures repeatedly, then it may be better for my mental well-being to change the goal rather than adhere to the same goal. Future research on grid should examine grid's factor structure and the relationship between grid and subjective well-being based on the measurement test, and also consider reporting the results of the two dimensions separately based on their measurement test to clarify the role of grid in shaping one's subjective well-being. This is it. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to email me. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope everyone stays well, and I very look forward to meeting in person next summer. Take care. Bye.
This presentation is titled Cultural Differences in Flourishing Among Workers. I'm Matthew Lee, and I prepared this paper with a number of colleagues listed below from both the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University and the Sustainability and Health Initiative for Net Positive Enterprise at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. First, some acknowledgments. This presentation was prepared for the regular session on health and well-being at the annual meeting of the American Sociological Association in San Francisco, California, to be shown on August 8th, 2020. We thank the John Templeton Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Aetna, a CVS health business, and anonymous donors to the Sustainability and Health Initiative for Net Positive Enterprise for grants and financial support in carrying out this research. Research findings represent the perspective of the authors and do not reflect the opinions or endorsement of any organization. In a short, roughly 10-minute presentation, we can only highlight some of the findings, but welcome inquiries about other aspects of our work at the Human Flourishing Program and other conversation about flourishing in cross-cultural contexts. As a brief overview, this paper presents cross-cultural comparisons of flourishing as measured by the 6 well-being domains of emotional health, physical health, purpose, character strengths, social connectedness, and financial security. Results are based on unidentifiable data from 9 surveys of employees, along with employed members of 1 credit union in Cambodia, China, Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, and the United States. Average well-being scores are higher in Mexico, China, and Cambodia than in the US across all domains except financial security. Social connectedness was the highest ranked domain in Cambodia and China, but ranked much lower, 4th or 5th, depending on the sample, in the US, out of 6 total categories. Cross-cultural comparisons of well-being to date have often focused on a somewhat restricted subset of measures, either physical health, financial security, subjective well-being, or selected aspects of subjective well-being, such as happiness or life satisfaction. We offer a cross-cultural comparison of flourishing or complete well-being that includes both psychosocial and material dimensions among working adults. A focus on the flourishing of working adults is especially important because this group generates the economic productivity that sustains other groups, including those who are retired, institutionalized, disabled, or too young to work. So, what is flourishing? At the Human Flourishing Program, led by Tyler Vanderweel, the senior author of this paper, we define flourishing as a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. We call this complete well-being. Flourishing domains at the very least requires doing or being well in the following 5 broad domains: happiness and life satisfaction, health, both mental and physical, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close social relationships. And each of these domains satisfies the following 2 criteria. It's generally viewed as an end in itself. People desire it for its own sake. And it's nearly universally desired. There are are, of course, other possible domains of complete well-being, but you might not find such broad agreement or agreement that they constitute an end in themselves. Some level of financial material stability is required to sustain these 5 domains over time. So we include that in our secure flourishing index, whereas the flourishing index is just the 5 domains themselves, the ends in themselves. Some would include a religious or spiritual dimension, and we have a separate measure for that we will not discuss in this presentation. The measures that have been created by Tyler and in some cases other colleagues in the program can be found at these 2 links on the screen. This discussion is drawn from Tyler's paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, listed here on this slide. Most conversations about flourishing describe it in terms of a multi-systemic model. And again, flourishing is complete well-being. So in Tyler's paper, the domains of flourishing are influenced by pathways like family, work, education, and religious community. Those are some of the most important ones. There are other pathways as well. In the Blue Zones model, there's a sense of a well-being ecosystem contributing to longevity and other forms of well-being, starting with a sense of belongingness, eating wisely, having a sense of purpose and good outlook, and having physical activity as an unavoidable part of the environment. Again, a sense of a well-being ecosystem contributing to the individual's overall flourishing. This image here is from the International Multiple Sclerosis Society, looking at flourishing at the individual level, indicated by these items, flourishing within one's immediate circumstances, indicated here, and then the contribution of the wider environment, including laws and policies, the economy, national stability, and so forth. There's a sense from the donut economics model that the goal of the good society is to meet the social foundation needs of all of its members without exceeding the ecological ceilings that sustain life. Looking at it from another perspective, the Well-Being in the Nation Network and other related groups talks about the cultivation of vital conditions rather than getting stuck in what they call an adversity economy, where dealing with adversity and urgent needs dominates the system as a whole. Rather, the goal is to move towards a well-being economy. And so everyone has a responsibility to be a good steward of the system in moving the society in this direction. So individual flourishing feeds into these more macro level concerns. Very briefly about our surveys. In Cambodia, China, Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, and 2 U.S. factories, survey data were gathered directly from factories and workplaces, except for a credit union survey in the U.S. Responses were collected on the Qualtrics platform using a tablet app. During survey administration, groups of workers were released from their line positions, most often one production line at a time, to come to the survey stations. One U.S. survey was conducted with employees of a white and pink collar office workplace rather than a factory using work computers. The U.S. credit union survey was collected using the Qualtrics platform. The next slide, which I'll show briefly, but you could certainly pause the video and explore it at your leisure, shows means and standard deviations for both flourishing and secure flourishing by country, as well as the individual domains. So the Secure Flourishing Index includes financial and material stability, as well as the other ends in themselves domains. The Flourish Index includes only the 5 domains, but not financial and material stability. And you can see that the highest Secure Flourish scores are in China, Cambodia, and Mexico. This despite the fact that the financial material stability score in Mexico, again among workers in a factory, is quite low indeed, and also low in Cambodia and Poland relative to the US. I should mention that these scores are on a 11-point scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest score. We also have a rank ordering of the domains in addition to the means and standard deviations. And you can see that the top ranked domain in China, Cambodia, is close social relationships, whereas close social relationships were ranked much lower relative to the other domains in the United States. There's some conversation about whether the means themselves are directly comparable across countries, and so it might be most helpful to focus on the rankings. And again, you can pause the video here and explore the table in more detail. To sum up, flourishing index scores were consistently higher in Mexico, China, and Cambodia than the US. The inclusion of financial and material stability reduced but did not erase this difference when we looked at the secure flourishing scores rather than the flourishing scores. Strong social relationships seem to thrive in locations with high financial insecurity, while such social connectedness appears somewhat lower in the US and Poland. The relatively low ranking of close social relationships in the US by both factory and non-factory respondents deserves further discussion. Here's a quote from the lead author of the World Happiness Report, quoted in a CNN article in 2019. John Helliwell says, "What stands out about the happiness in most well-connected societies is their resilience and ability to deal with bad things, their high social capital where people are connected." In terms of limitations, we did not have nationally representative samples. Our samples of workers were much younger, with the exception of one US sample, and more likely to be female than the general population in each country. Nevertheless, our results provide more detailed benchmarking on 6 domains of flourishing and 2 composite measures than more generalizable samples with fewer domains, particularly with regard to the rank ordering of the domains. Comparison with other countries suggests that more attention be given to the domain of social connectedness in the US, a finding that resonates with the conclusions of the World Happiness Report, with its more limited well-being focus, of course, not flourishing, as well as related scholarship. And we can point to classic studies such as Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone about the collapse and revival of American communities.